When we started that show, we had no point of view, except we'd like to be relevant, and that was it, and have control. My mother was pretty important, and we did start singing in the Packard, going back and forth from the valley to Pasadena and back and forth, and she'd always start singing, "You Are My Sunshine" down in the valley. We all sang along, Dickie and I, and our sister wasn't into it yet. And when I asked for a guitar, she gave me a guitar when I was 10, got me a guitar. And so there was some interest there. My father was a West Pointer, and he was captured in Corregidor and went to the Bataan Death March. But during the time he was a POW there, some of the people that got back said he was really into Gilbert and Sullivan and the little operettas of satires. And so he was musical, and my mother was musical, and Dickie and I were musical. So it kind of piqued our, singing together was always natural. My dad was supposed to be pretty funny, but he was a practical joker who could not take the joke on himself. It was a little more like my brother. My brother's like that. He likes a joke, but don't joke on him. And my mother was problematic in many ways. I was married like 4 times. So we moved around between our grandparents and her and our uncles and aunts. So we had a lot of different movements as growing up. So Dick and I were always like stuck together. No, all the comedy was spontaneous. We never planned to be a comedy team. We really, in high school, we had some quartets, and we're singing songs like Shaboom and some of these older love songs, specialty songs. But when the Kingston Trio happened and folks music started happening, it changed everything. And I was funny in high school. I mean, I did some plays, and I also did what you call MC work, announcing this or that. And I knew I was kind of funny, but I didn't know what it was. But when we got doing the folk songs up at San Jose State, we only knew 4 songs, I guess. So every song I'd introduce differently. I'd make up something. And finally, after a couple of weeks, my brother, and they started getting less funny and less funny. And he said, "Why don't you try repeating one of those things?" I said, "I can't remember what it was." He said, "Yeah, you do. I'll remind you." I said, "But if I do that, people will know." I believe truly that you could sing a song again and again. They knew that it's a song. But when you were talking, I thought that was all supposed to be, and they could read it. And then the first time I repeated a joke or an attitude, and it got the laugh, I said, "They don't know. They don't know." So we did 11 albums. They were all improvisational. So that's what our work was, improvisational. And we evolved into a comedy team because of that. Pretty soon, I would be introducing a song. Dickie said, "That's not right." I say, "Yes, it is." He says, "No, it's not." Then a little longer, he says, "That's not right, and you're stupid." A little longer and longer. It became this little non-premeditated relationship, which is pretty close to real life. It doesn't have to be exactly right, but it's got to have those. It's got to have that space in it. And I was a big fan of Laurel and Hardy's, and also Bob Newhart and Jack Benny, and people who had air. I always call it the air, the space between the notes. And I always thought that's what made it sing for me. It made it musical for me. And it wasn't premeditated. It was because I was terribly dyslexic, and I had all these so the process, even when I'm searching for a word or a way to explain it, uses some air, and as we worked more and more, it became a craft, and I kind of knew where some of the things were and where the space should be. But it's still a magic moment when we come out and open the show and I ad-lib and I'm going, I don't know exactly where. And for some reason, it always, 90% of the time it works out, and other times I'm looking like Johnny Carson, well, I tried, making up for the jokes, but it was a pretty organic act we had. At 15 years old, I was a sophomore in high school. I saw George Gobel on the Ed Sullivan Show. And this is about the time that I was kind of the class clown, but never perceived a professional job in it. But I saw George Gobel he did this thing about the bowling, lost his bowling ball. It just came out with that flat top, and there was no hard jokes at all. And I remember this, I said, oh man, I'd like to do that. And he talked about the bowling ball. He had to go down, and he reported it stolen. He had to go down to the police department. They said, can you give a description? And he said, yes, it's black and round, and it has 3 holes. They said, are the holes on the top or the bottom? And I remember that, well, that was funny. That's all I remember of it. I got to see him before he passed away, spent some time. He was on the show one time, and I kept telling him, you're my first influence in comedy, and my first influence in music was Burl Ives. So you put those two together and you get kind of the Smothers Brothers, you know. We were doing 2 albums a year when we got hired by Mercury Records, our first album was Everything We Knew. Second album, 6 months later, I said, we don't have it. So we scrambled for material. And one side was all singing with an orchestra. Third album, we're just barely by the skin of our teeth. And one of them was Dick. When Dick is good, my brother's a straight man. He's kind of like a relentless, like the guy, Abbott and Costello, like Bud Abbott was relentless with Lou Costello. And Dickie had a roll going in St. Louis. We're recording the show, and we had 3 days to get it down, then edit it together. And he had a roll going, and they were just the audience was starting to turn on him. Says, you're stupid, you're dumb, you've never done anything right in your life, you've been a disappointment to everybody, you're da-da-da-da. And he had about 5 in a row, and he finished, and I looked at him and I said, oh yeah, and Mom liked you best. I mean, just to add the thing, it just came out from nowhere. It was on the floor. And although, in fact, our whole act, I look back at some of the lines we're doing now, I said, where'd we get those? Because they weren't written, because they were an attitude between 2 people. But Mom liked you best was the only thing we've ever been quoted on. And oh yeah? Well, we were working at the Blue Angel in New York. It was our first time working in New York, and we were opening act for a wonderful actor who was doing a whole lot of Jack Parr shows. And it was Guido Panzini, called Guido Panzini, the Italian golf pro, had this fake accent. And he had this act, I can't remember his name.
Pat Harrington, we're talking to him in a few minutes.
Pat Harrington Jr. He was a guy who said, man, let me try to get you on the night show. I think you guys are great. So they came down, people saw us, said, man, that's pretty good. So they made us go to the night show with the bass and the guitar in the taxi cab and go up to the top floor and do it in front of this guy in front of a desk. 3 people said, go ahead and do your act. I go, oh man. They said, well, maybe we'll use you next week or something like that. And then someone fell through and they brought us on. And the talent coordinator really liked us. And he says, okay, now you'll be fine. And they wanted to block our act, which is standing up there and walking through it. And it was the foxes, quack, 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 quack. So I said, well, don't do that. Just tell us how. So we talked it through. Oh, the fox went out, and then my brother starts quacking, and they're going, oh, man. Okay, then just before we go on, the guy says, listen, the stage manager says, if I do this, that means speed it up. If I do this, that means just stop and go. I thought we were going to get to meet Mr. Parr. So we don't know. So the talent coordinator took us back to see Jack Parr before the show. And he says, you know, what's the difference between hillbilly and folk singers? What's the difference? He says, I don't like hillbilly music. I said, well, the difference between hillbilly and folk music is that hillbilly sings higher. He thought that was very funny. So when we got on the show, he did his introduction, and he said, I'd never heard of him before. I don't know if you met. And we were a hit. I mean, just like that. We did 13 of his last that year, and he had us on all the time. He was a big fan. I was a big fan of his too. And so we owe our initial start in our career to Jack Parr. He put us in some terrible situations with Jonathan Winters when he just got out of the Connecticut House of Living, and he put us together, and man, and there was no commercials then. They had plenty of time. You had 7, 8 minutes between commercials, and it was like, he was very involved in Tractors for Cuba. This was after the Bay of Pigs or something like that. They said, don't mention any of that on talent guy. They said, don't mention that. The pre-interview, don't mention anything. Of course, don't ever tell a comedian not to mention something. We had a great time with him. And then Steve Allen came to us and put us on a regular basis after Jack Parr got off. And I was with Tim Conway and a whole bunch of wonderful, Bill Dana. Steve Allen just really respected the comic mind and jazz. He thought they were the same thing, as we correlate music and comedy. And he had more comedians on that show. And they would write, and sometimes it was just one guy's arm that would come up in a sketch, because that's all there was so many people that they had to service. But that was a big one for us. You know, our first time we ever worked the Purple Onion, as I recall, we were going to San Jose State, and we were working a beer hall for $5 a night, or all the beer we could drink. And some guy said, you gotta go up and audition at the Purple Onion. So we didn't have a car then, so he drove us up there, and last Saturday every week, and we auditioned, and they thought it was pretty funny, and said, well, maybe in 3 or 4 months when we have an opening. Well, the following week, the flamenco dancer got sick, and they said, we want you right away. So we said, well, okay, let's give ourselves, it was 13 straight weeks there. And it was 4 shows a week, and we were working with Phyllis Diller. And she'd only been in the business for a couple of years herself, and we just starting. So her 50th anniversary was just, I think, this year. And ours is coming up in 2 years. So I thought she was wonderful, and she was so nice to us. She was so young, we were so young. Dickie was underage when we started. And I was 21, Dickie was 20. And she said, God, you gotta we were wearing short pants. You gotta put a bandage on your knee. That looked kind of cool, like it'd fall down. It was all this camaraderie. There was only 90 people in the room, I guess, could seat. One little tiny dressing room we all changed in. Dickie always remembers the Phyllis Diller story. She was out, Ronnie Shell and her, and I guess the 3 of us on the bill. No, she ended the show real fast. And she come back, she said, oh my God, I had my period. And she had a little thing and running down her leg. And she was always so kind of really earthy kind of woman. She was great. She gave us great support all through our career. Some interviewer asked me the strangest question. He said, imagine yourself as a 10-year-old sitting right over there looking at, what do you think you as a boy would have thought of you now? I'm going, and I thought about my son. I said, well, he's so much like me. And he's 13 now, but when he's about 10, that age, he'd seen our show. He knew I did the Yo-Yo Man, and we did these things. And then he would be upset why Dickie would call me stupid and stuff like that. I said, it's part of the act. Okay. And I was teasing him. I wasn't getting a response at the dinner table. I said, Bo, do you think I'm funny? He said, oh, yeah, Dad, but I just don't get it. Isn't that sweet? He knows I'm funny, but he doesn't get it. And I said, that's probably what I would have thought, but he has a quick temper. He's very much like me. And sometimes you get that back, and you got to live with that same little person. Those are the parents, you know, that little thing. I said, oh man, what did my mother and grandparents have to put up with Dickie and I in the back seat? Did to his hands on, I mean, every one of those cliches, all the way, Mom liked you best. We all thought that. I first time visualized, but it was my daughter and my son. They're 3 years apart, and all they do is did to you, liar. You know, and it just brings us to tears sometimes. I stopped the car, said, get out. But that's what we all did. I just forgot about it. And so Dickie and I have made a career of it, and we had some couple counseling about 10 years ago because it's always been so volatile. And that's part of its gift. It's a double-edged sword. There's no doubt who these personalities are on stage, and we don't have to fake them. We just kind of exaggerate them a little bit. And so we had to have couple counseling, and my brother suggested it, and we weren't even talking to each other hardly. And it wasn't over anything important. just like timing or what time we got dressed to get ready to go on. And a friend of ours who used to be a road manager for the Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, he said, your fights are nothing compared to the Dorsey brothers. I said, really? He said, oh man, they cleared a room. I said, what were they arguing about? Tempo? They're arguing about tempo. So it was a little thing. So we had this counseling thing, and what it amounted to is stop relating to each other as brothers. There's no history here. Treat each other as professionals, respect each other's thing, and if there's notes to give, and it changed a lot. We still squabble a little bit, but professionally, because being a comedy team is probably as difficult as any kind of a form of comedy, and stand-up is easy compared to working with someone else if they're out of sync and you start to hate them and hope a truck would hit them or something like that. But it's something you have to work on all the time, tolerance, acceptance, and try to glorify the good points that you see about someone, because the bad one just notice all the time. You just got to keep forgetting them. They both feel that way about our different things. It's like an old marriage, Dickie says. It's like an old marriage, a lot of fighting and no sex. So Dickie's a funny one off stage. I'm the funny one on stage. Timing is such a fragile thing, and some people have it, some people don't. You don't know. An actor has to have it, a sense of timing too, but comedy is feeling an audience response. That's why Jack Benny was never really good in films. And I wasn't very good in films, because quiet on the sad road, okay, action. That stops me cold. I feel an audience tension. And that's where my timing comes from. And Dickie feels a little, but he doesn't. So that's our differences. And I say, you gotta hold that a little longer. He says, I'm holding it right. And no, you're not. He says, fuck you, excuse me. That's what we get down to. We'll get down to serious room clearing, only sibling conversations can go to. And we still have our differences on the timing thing. And I know it, and he's not sure about it. But as I talk about my brother, he is so believable, even when his timing's off. But he's so believable on stage, it makes the act work. Because if you don't believe the straight man, you won't believe the comic. If you don't believe, that's why Dean Martin was so good, and that was why Dan Rowan was such a great straight man, and Oliver Hardy, George Burns. So you believe the straight man, you believe the act, no matter how outrageous the comedian goes. If you believe he's buying that, it's a dialogue, it's a trialogue. You, he, and the audience. So there's three people you're talking to. You always go, he's so stupid, aren't you? So there's a three-way dialogue. So then the straight man was paid more money in early vaudeville. It was called a skilled position. And Abbott and Costello, when they were first put together, Bud Abbott was paid more money by about 10%. And not until in the 30s and the movies started happening did that differential happen, not take place. Because a straight man can take it, as you say, magicians can take people out of the audience and get laughs off of them. And the same way a good straight man is always, he's a drummer, he's a bass player, he keeps a tempo, he keeps things in control. He doesn't get out of line. So sometimes I always say, let's take a look at the straight man. And I watch Bud Abbott more than Lou Costello, or watch Dickie more than you watch me, and you'll see, because they're always checking. As long as he's real, I'm real. Well, back in the 50s and the 60s, there was only one show to watch it if you were awake at 11 o'clock. And that was Jack Parr. It was the only late night show. And when you're on that show, or Steve Allen, when he had before Jack Parr, you're on that show, if you were good, you were a hit. It made your career. Nowadays you go on these shows and it doesn't matter. But they had such a power then. And if you had a sympathetic and empathetic guy like Jack Parr, and like Johnny Carson, who always could work. They could work either side of the equation. Made you sing. I couldn't, after the first Jack Parr show, I couldn't walk around New York. I bought a hat and sunglasses. I get into a thing. The guy say, "Hey, saw you last night on Jack. Hey, Tommy, how you doing? What, you hiding? You hiding?" I said, "No, obviously not." But fame, when it comes, is such a shock. It's something that every entertainer wants to get, and when they get it, it is shocking in its evasiveness into totally what you did not expect, and it's totally that you did not particularly want. You wanted to be a star, but you didn't want to have that stuff that went with it, where you go to a restaurant and you feel, you can't eat and people are staring at you. And I finally got over that. It took a long time, but I'd go in with a date or something and be talking, and she'd kind of be looking over my shoulder, and then look back. I said, "Is someone staring over here?" I said, "Never mind." So I go, "Oh." I make eye contact. I said, "How you doing?" He says, "Fine." I said, "Good to see you." "It's good to see you." And I turned back, and I give him about 4 seconds and turn back and catch him again. And that was the last of it. Then all of a sudden it became a bubble. But Pat Paulson went through this terrible thing. He just couldn't wait to become successful. And I warned him. I said, pretty soon he was hiding out in corners of restrooms, ordering room service because he didn't know how to handle that. So that's the other side of fame. And probably the biggest joy people get out of being a star or successful at their performing career, the biggest gift is the performance. That's the part. That's where you feel the celebrity coming from the audience, or when you're doing a show. That is, and being on stage and performing, that's the essence of it. Now, if I could wipe out the other stuff, and then walk around invisible, that'd be great. Being at the scene of the accident, which I refer for the Comedy Hour, was in 1967, 68, 69, and 77. It was a long accident. But we commented on the accident. And the accident was Vietnam and Kent State and the Chicago riots of the Democratic Convention and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. All this happened while we had a television show. And we were half prepared to recognize these things and reflect them because of our prior experience in a sitcom. Just before that, with Aaron Spelling was a producer, and the show was a half-hour sitcom without an audience. There was a situation comedy called the Smothers Brothers show, where I was an angel and came back to earn my wings. But it was without an audience. We were warned. It was without an audience, and we were put with these wonderful actors. It was overwritten for me. And it was just, we did 32, and we were #1 in our slot every night. But it was 32 of these, so it was just awful. And I had no control, didn't own the show, had no position. I said, boy, if we ever get another show, I'm gonna have creative control, because that's the way it's gonna be. We're not gonna do this vacuous stuff. We'll do something relative that relates to real time. Well, real time started happening all around us, and we reflected it. And I started putting in writers, not that nobody knew, Mason Williams and Steve Martin and a bunch of younger writers, and we started driving our own ship, and reflecting things. And I had no idea we were saying anything important until he said, "You got to stop." And that happens to a lot of people. If they'd have just let us go, I probably wouldn't have gone any further. But the point is, we thought there should be a show, should be really entertaining, but it should have some relevance to about what's happening in there. And Bob Hope was saying, support the troops and support the president and all this stuff. And we said, well, there should be another point of view too. And so that was our point of view. And it was very gentle, and it was done in wonderful satire. And if we did this today, we'd be thrown off the air again, maybe quicker. Dixie Chicks can't even get their records played hardly anymore. So times have lightened up. They've gotten much tougher, and television allowed people to use dirty words and talk about sex and violence and homosexuality and drugs, whatever it is, but there's no content of a real discussion of issues. unless it's a drama on abortion or gay rights or something like that. But there's no political conversation or criticism except in the corners of the television, like Bill Maher and The Daily Show and a few of those. And even the real good satirical shows like Saturday Night Live have gotten soft, and they're caustic more than insightful, and smart ass more than any depth to them. Shot better, everybody's looking for a career. But back then they were looking to really do some good stuff, create some good ideas and sketches. I think we went off about. Anyway, that show had a great mixture of people we admired. We got to be Betty Davis, Lana Turner, Jack Benny, George Burns, Jimmy Durante. My God, these were people that when we were little kids. And here we got to work with them. Jack Benny and George Burns was 72 when he did our show. Just a year or two older than me. And he had all this energy, and Jack Benny was starting to kind of lose it, and George Burns was kind of giving him cues to what the next line was. But, and then we had all these young rock and roll acts and young comedians and stuff. So it was a great mix. And Mason Williams was kind of my moral, ethical mentor, as we'd read scripts Saturday night, we'd come back to Monday, read them, we'd go through the next script, and bullshit, good, bullshit, good. And then I wouldn't tell everybody that was Mason did it because he was a new writer on the show. Oh, he's got a Svengali in his ear, tell him what's. But it was always right. The things that were vacuous, we tried to get rid of. Although I look at the old shows, in hindsight, I see a lot of stuff got by.
You always want to tinker. You want to make it.
Oh, I still want to go back and edit them. As far as our political consciousness evolving, and it evolved on the show. When we started that show, we had no point of view, except we'd like to be relevant, and that was it, and have control. And the protests started happening in the war. We started seeing stuff, and the networks were really covering it like they're not now. And so we started to see this, and there was also some drug stuff going. Everybody was smoking grass then, and it was the 60s. It was a great time. And there was alternative choices in thinking, so that reflected in our show. And we just started going, and when they say don't do it, you press, you push back and press, and I was making very sure that we weren't fired on a technicality because we didn't play by the rules. So I played by the rules. And they don't. I didn't know there was a hardball. There was 2 games going on. That's naivete of life, but I said, oh man. And in hindsight, I look back and there's probably nothing I could have done. Nothing. And once Richard Nixon got in a conservative agenda with the war, there was no spot for the kind of satire we did. And so in hindsight, I look back and I said, well, that wasn't I did play it right, I was brinkmanship with them, but it was very emotional to be fired when you knew you hadn't done anything wrong except exercise this freedom of expression. But it was a great wake-up call, and it's a character builder. And to have to do it all over again was amazing, because we stopped performing. Las Vegas dried up for us. No one would hire us. We started doing dinner theater. I did Play It Again Sam for darn near half a year, different productions. Then Dickie and I got this offer to do a Broadway show. We did that for about 2 years. Didn't do the act at all. We thought it was over. We couldn't get an agent or anything. And then Robin Williams said one time, hey, we're doing a benefit down in LA for battered women. You got 5 minutes? I went and looked at the album, and I listened to an album. My fingers were all the calluses were gone on my guitar hand. We did one piece, and it kind of went pretty good. I said, wow, geez, you want to try it again? We had all these skills we learned from acting, which was head turns and pacing and a lot of different things. And so we went out and started working these little tiny clubs and discos and comedy clubs and Houston, all different little places. And we knew what the road was. It was a long one. We knew how hard it took 10 years the first time and just about 8 years the second time. Finally, an agent handled us. Pretty soon we were just opening for Lola Falana. We were headlining. And there's a nice edge to the act that wasn't there before. The first time is you're amazingly different and unique and surprising. Second time they see you coming, and you better be good, you better be smooth, and it better be just as exciting, but it's not unique anymore, you know. So, but it had a little edge to it that was different. Then we were both better craftsmen, and that's what it takes for longevity, and not quitting. It was easy to quit. Well, you know, when you're doing it, you don't know. It's all hindsight, and then you say, "Gosh, we're shaking some boxes and rattling some cages." But at the time you're doing, you're just trying to do the best show you can, and pushing the limits as much as you can. But I guess it wasn't shaking up Lyndon Johnson as much as we shook up Nixon. I mean, we were fired, and then and that was right from the White House. That came, and then we're going to put him up. And Dr. Stanton, William Paley, and Mr. Annenberg, once Nixon was elected, were all just desperately looking for the court of St. James, the ambassadorship to Britain. And who got it? The last guy I mentioned, TV Guide, right. Annenberg. Right. So Annenberg got it. You should have seen the editorial when we were fired. Oh, and we just had the front page of TV Guide about 4 months before. It was awful. God, I said, oh man, these guys are awful. I'd fire them too after I read that. But so there was a lot of political pressure of significant kind on us. And drug busts were set up, all kinds of things to discredit.
Dirty tricks?
Yeah. But that's, you go, oh man. Dixie Chicks said one thing, and you can't even, where's the First Amendment? Since the corporations own the government, the corporations do whatever they want. If the government doesn't say, we want you to do that, the collusion's obvious. But when we were doing television, CBS was owned by one person, NBC, ABC competing. You can only own so many papers and so many radio stations in one market. And that was, so it was really a fair distribution of news and information and points of view. And now it's absolutely the opposite. So we were at least had an opportunity to be at the scene of an accident and express a point of view on it. And today you can't do that. So, and be entertaining. That's all the important. You had to be funny. You have to be funny. And if you're like U2's doing with their music, if you put it in an art form that is palatable and kind of subterfuge, you get the message across, and it's a humanistic message about making the world a better place. Basically, that's what it's about. We were tainted. See, we were popular, we were tainted, and it was become and I wasn't getting eye contact from my contemporaries and my peers. Because, it's like you got the dreaded disease or something. You go in, good to see you, Tom. Hope things work out, a little drop of the eyes and stuff. So we moved out of LA, and both of us moved north, so we would have to deal with that kind of sympathy, combination of those different things, because it was a big deal. And so Dickie opened a winery, did some racing, and I learned some theater. I lost my sense of humor for about 3 years and got it back and put it in right perspective and didn't take. See what happens when you're thrown off the air and you become a symbol of the First Amendment. You become a poster boy, and then you start fulfilling, and everything is desperately serious. And I lost where the joke was. And the same thing with Howard Stern. I said, what an unlikely poster boy for the First Amendment. I mean, I wish you would say something of value instead of supporting the right to say it, but that's the essence of it. the right to say whether we approve or not. But I said, yeah. So during that time was a lonely time, being dreadfully serious, and everything was important, and everything is important, but it has to be leavened by the fact that this is life you're going through. You better find the joke here somewhere. Tweaking the people in power and kind of walking the edge, I loved it. I said to my son, my 13-year-old when he was about 10, I said, you know, it's up to each to be a free American, you know, question authority now and then. Well, he took it wrong. He's questioning his teacher. Sit down. I don't want to. I'm going to question your authority. I said, no, Bo, that's not what it means. Question power. When you see it's out of whack. A question. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed sending all these memos back and forth to the vice president, the president, and program practices, and kind of crafting the words. And it was a little fun. Of course, it was fun. It was fun. Even though it was getting serious, it was fun there. And then when I finally lost that round, it wasn't. I forgot where the joke was. I really did. But it only took 3 years to get back the bounce. Well, when we first worked the Purple Onion, we were working about 3 weeks as professionals. I think he was 29, 21. This guy comes down in a business suit after our third show, and he says, "That's pretty good. You want you guys?" I thought he was on the tour, you know, on the bus line tour, and he said, "You got to put a little more comedy in it. Try a little more comedy." I said, "We're doing a lot of comedy." He said, "Well, try a little more." I mean, only had 3 songs. The rest I was just. About 2 weeks later, this guy comes back in and said, "I saw you a couple of weeks ago. You got to put more comedy in." And he left, and I was kind of mad at him. I said to this bartender, "Who the hell is that?" He says, "Pat Paulson. He's working with his wife up the road. He's a comedian, this dreadfully deadpan guy." And so I started hanging out with him, and I just thought he was so great. He did street theater, and it was just, he was the world's greatest liar, that deadpan thing. And the minute I got the sitcom, I put him on that, and all I gave him was a little walk. I said, "You don't see it. You don't see how great this guy is." So when I got my show, that's what I missed the most about not having a television show: the power or the ability to allow someone to be a star. That was the greatest thing. That's what Parr liked, and Steve Allen liked. I liked it. It was so great to pick people out there who were still green and stuff and pop them in. And Pat Paulson was one of my greatest gifts to show business, I think. And to me, too, he was the deepest color and most defined character on the Smothers Brothers comedy hour. Steve Allen was hard to get to know. Steve Allen this man is a Renaissance man. I had no idea how socially active and what a strong ethical center this man had. He was the first, he was a member of SANE, nuclear policy and stuff, all this stuff it was going through. I had no idea when I was doing my show, and I was not until later in the season that I recognized how socially important he was and how brilliant he was. And he wasn't a comedian's comedian. He said funny things. He wasn't a comedian, like, you know the difference between them, right? There's one that says funny things, the other one says things funny, and he was that other side. But he just loved music, he loved comedy, and he had a soul, and he wrote a lot of books. Gosh, those television shows he did with meeting people from different, what was that called? Meeting of Minds. The Meeting of the Minds. I had the passion, I had the passion, I had the essence. I didn't have the smarts. I didn't have all the stuff, all those tools. I wish I had the tools like Bill Maher has. I wish I had the tools like Steve Allen, because there's so many things I'd like to say, but I don't know how to say them. And if I start saying them, they become heavy-handed and they become advocacy instead of showing the absurdity of things. So my speeches were kind of heavy. It was hard for me to do political satire without becoming passionate about it. So that's what I liked about Steve Allen. And he was such a fan of ours, and he gave us so many opportunities. He and Jack Parr are the two people who that we owe most to in our career. What was special about Dan Rowan was, we're the only other comedy team at the time working darn near, but Dan Rowan was one of the great straight men. He had that ease, a little bit of Dean Martin in him. He had a little bit of Oliver Hardy. He was just this great straight man. And he was the only comedy team. All comedy teams said the comedian was driven. Stan Laurel, driven. Lou Costello, driven. Jerry Lewis, driven. The straight men were playing golf, they were doing stuff. But Rowan and Martin, the straight man was a guy that was over the script and more involved in that thing. And so when Dickie went away to race one time, Dan came on and was my straight man. Working with him was just like working with Dickie. It was very nice.
And that was the very day your show was canceled.
Yes, it was. Dickie. That show was a show that caused all the problem, the one with Dan Rowan. It was a great show. And so it wasn't the show. It wasn't the show. It was foredoomed. It was nothing we could do. All kinds of reasons in Steinberg's sermonette, or it was Easter. Dwight Eisenhower died. I don't know. There's 1,000 things they can throw out there, but the truth was they weren't going to be seen again while Richard Nixon was in office. Yeah, the minute I started realizing that I was a comic, that I was a comedian, in a kind of a real sense, I started studying Lowell and Hardy, and we did a couple of Jack Benny shows, and he did some on ours, and that wonderful, that air, that space that he could do, and it was always, and he always had a live audience. I said, well, he always had a live audience, because that was you could feel the tension. The great comedian. I wish and Dickie too, not as much. I love showbiz a little more than him. He's very eclectic. He likes race cars, he likes everything. But of all the regrets I have, I never took the time or made the time, I didn't have much time, to make the time to spend more personally with Jack Benny and George Burns and also Stan Laurel was still alive, not well, but alive. And Buster Keaton I was so busy doing my show that I didn't, see, that's my regret, is not being able to spend time, and they were still vital, and there was some spunk in them, and I'd go see George Burns at the Caesar's Palace, and I'd go backstage, and they come down all dressed with a perfect, he said, "Hi, Tom, how's your brother? You like a martini?" Make a martini. I did my little, But to spend time, I wish I got to. So I got to know the people come and say, "God, you got to know John Lennon. You were hanging out with John Lennon. You sang in the Bed In for Peace, and you were with Harry Nilsson, and you got to know Keith Moon and all those guys." And we go through this thing. But what I want to know, we were mostly stoned and carrying on and stuff, But this was the Jack Benny. I got to spend a lot of good time with Harry Nilsson, who we spent real time together. And that was just a tremendous talent. But I got to spend some time with Betty Davis, some more personal time. And that was, she always said, "Don't let them beat you down, kid. Stick up for your," I was having all the, this was unheard of then. During our show, our second season, I had a video. It was all reel to reel, not like we have now. And I would tape the dress rehearsals and tape the dress, and then they'd give notes, and there was always an hour and a half, and I'd go through these ones I thought were problems too, and look at them. And they said, "You're emasculating the director," and they want to stop me, so they said, "Okay, it's going to take a union man to run this little machine." So I said, "Okay." So the union guy would be down there and pushing it, and I told Betty Davis about it. She said, "Honey, you just do what you know is right to do, and just take care of yourself, So I started looking at people who were known as difficult, that I heard were difficult, and looked at them with a different eye, because they were generally trying to accomplish something. It was generally not an ego trip. It was execution and craft, trying to make something a little better. That's what my conclusion, 90% of them are.
Of course, Betty Davis, you almost blew her up.
She was on the show with The Who.
That's right.
She with the two different worlds, Betty Davis and The Who blowing up their guitars. Every time we show this little piece on our show, our live show, a little 12-minute hunk of the highlights of the show, and I see Peter Townsend taking the guitar right in front of the riser where Keith Moon's playing the drums, and bam, things are smoking. He takes it back the third time and the drum goes out. If it had come down the third time when that would have blown his ears out, might have killed him. But I mean, Betty Davis and the sound of it, there wasn't compressors on the mic. It would have. It sounds normal, but I mean, it was out there. It was in real life. It was huge. Then we had some great writing. We had some wonderfully creative people working that show, much like Sid Caesar had in the Show of Shows. And there were kind of breakthrough variety show. And I also loved Ed Sullivan. I hired away his director, Tim Kiley, and I'd see him do Gladys Knight and the Pips behind a blue screen, and then they bring out and it was live, at that time, and they'd bring out an elephant, and then it'd be a teeter board act. I said, God, now it's a great show, Tim. Tommy Smothers, love your work. And if I get to New York, I said, should I have a drink with you? I said, boy, it should be nice if you were out here. And I hired him away. They were so angry. Sullivan people were so angry. But he was just a fun, good director. And I went through directors like I went through writers. I was historically known as a very difficult person to work with. I was a perfectionist, and that is difficult to work with. When people try to make, and a lot of times I didn't have an evolved taste to make some of these reaches for perfection, I've apologized to most of the people, and they said, no, it's not even needed. That was the process we were going through. And when I think of Roseanne Barr, how difficult she's supposed to be, and how successful her show was, because that reflected her. And people said, man, she was such a bitch. Underneath that it was a direction. And when you see wonderful talents get bogged down in television shows because they get committee, Jim Foxworthy's show. I mean, it's too many. I'm not gonna. If I go down this time, it's going to be under my flag. I'll be responsible, and eventually I was. A little always anxiety before you performed, and Ed Sullivan's show was a little anxious to it, but we've been working so much. Been working. So we had our chat. We weren't nervous about the Jack Parr show, because we've been working clubs where they're drinking beer and yelling at you and stuff. I said, well, this is pretty easy. So it's not much of there's not much anxiety before we go out. There is an edge, because if you don't, you're not prepped enough. So the fear of bombing is so powerful in every comedian's psyche, dying, bombing, all these things. It's you just can't let that happen. You'll do anything not to make that happen. Creative things happen that way. Oh yeah, I think his was with us. It was, and their father was a war hero and killed in Japan. Here they are, the Smothers Brothers. Some kind of little thing like that. But I thought Ed Sullivan did I thought that show was just. And he had a great deal to do with it. And he would moving acts around. He was trying to balance a show to make it work. And he was he ran that show. That was his thing. And this kind of non-personality guy, amazing. And in the audience thing, which is there's some great stuff. No, life has changed rapidly, and when you have that many choices now on television and the cable, and you can go 100 channels, and And there's not a commonality. We all knew the #1 song when I was growing up. Everybody knew it. Whether you're a little kid, it was on the hit parade for 10 weeks or 20 weeks. And I don't know if that's whether it's good or bad. I think we have more choices now, but I miss that sense of America when there was more a commonality and agreement on so many things. And now it's a brave new world. There's a lot of choices. And we're not getting to see these choices, unfortunately. But there's a lot of choices out there. We have a very corrupt system we're living in. And it takes a lot more effort to find out the truths than it used to. We've got to. And still think there's a joke here. No, you see it, I say Bill Maher, and I think he's just wonderful. He's a Will Rogers of today. And you see the Stewart show. We had our day in the sun, and it was perfect. We were just barely sophisticated enough to pull it off. And being a victim as a character, and short-haired and kind of neat, kind of helped it all. But it wasn't a real articulate stab at the status quo and making it change. I think today it really needs to be, requires much more skills than we had back then. But at that moment, we were at the accident and it was perfect, and we reflected it perfectly and rode the horse to the finish line. Mason Williams kept saying, Tom, the Smothers Brothers comedy, he said, Tom, you're spending too much time on directing, on staying on the writing, involved in the booking and all this. You're not spending enough time on you and Dick. You're going to be sorry. And there was a little regret because our best work was not done on the Comedy Hour. We were the centerpiece of it, but the best work was all around it, the concepts and stuff. The next time I did a show was in '88, '89, and I made a point, no cue cards. Everything would be around 3 minutes. You had to learn your lines, unless it was a straight introduction, in the camera. We had to learn lines. Well, Dickie and I, it's the best work we've ever done, and nobody really saw it that much. But it was really good, and I've got it on videotape. So that's our. There's two things: that Comedy Hour, which I'm so proud of, but I wasn't proud of the Smothers performances. But the second show, Return of the Smothers, was really our best work. The best thing we ever did in enjoyment we had was Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. I Love My Wife on Broadway, which we did for a year. And at the Riviera, a show called Solid Gold, a review we did for 6-8 months. It doesn't mean anything to anybody, except we had the best time. We do fundraisers thing for PBS. We'd like to do one more special with all of our work at this level, which has not been seen on television, really, a lot of the stuff. And it's really good. We should have had a sitcom, Dickie and I, with an audience. With an audience. We interviewed NBC for a sitcom about 3 years ago, and William Morris brought us in 30-something women. She's a big deal. So what is your relationship? What is the relationship between you and your brother? And I said, it doesn't matter. So we're not interested. Although people, you can't be too proud of the fact that people under 40 don't know who you are or what you do, because that's the case. And our recognition point after 45 is, 80%. Under 45, it's about 10%. So it goes like that. That's what it is. That's what show business is. So if you're not visible, you're forgotten. They're taking down Laurel and Hardy. I said that because kids don't know who he is, who they are. That's when you know you're getting old. When back to the '80s is God. That's way back there. And my son's born in 1996. I said 1996. Jeez.